Welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue looking at the forces unleashed by the French Revolution, specifically looking at this idea of nationalism and how, although nationalism helped unite countries into nation states like Italy and Germany, what effect is nationalism going to have on already created multinational empires? And so, in order to try to answer that question, we're going to look at the age of Tanzimat in the Ottoman Empire, returning, of course, to the Islamic world, to again look at how these forces, as they sort of spread across different societies, how they affect societies differently. So here are your objectives. You should, by the end of this, you should be able to explain the challenges facing the Ottoman Empire in the 1800s, look at the reforms of Tanzimat and the response of the Janissaries to those reforms, and then we're going to look at a conflict called the Crimean War, which we talked about briefly when we talked about the unification of Italy, but it's a war sort of between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. And so over the next 2 days, we're going to look at it from both sides, sort of explaining the various outcomes of the war and how they affected these two societies differently. So the Ottoman Empire, as you hopefully remember, was at one point the center of the sort of European and Mediterranean world. They were the center of Islam after their conquering the holy cities in Arabia. They were a center of technology, a center of medicine, a center of art and culture. They were the pinnacle of civilization in the 1600s. But over time, obviously, all things change. Societies sort of fall apart over time. Leaders become complacent, and you can't stay on top forever, quite frankly. And so the Ottoman Empire has been sort of chipped away at over a period of time, as in general, the bureaucrats become more corrupt, the sultans become less interested in ruling, and this multinational empire has to deal with these problems of nationalism, because the Ottoman Empire, by its definition, cannot be a nation state. It's an empire ruled primarily by Turkish people, but they have all these different groups of people. And so the same way that the French want a France and the Italians want an Italy and the Germans want a Germany, the Egyptians would like to have an Egypt. The Arabs would like to have an Arabia. The Hungarians would like to have a Hungary. And so this is going to lead to significant revolts throughout the empire, which is going to cost substantial amounts of blood and treasure to put down, and is simply going to expedite the Ottoman decline. So during this time period, the Ottoman Empire becomes known as the sick man of Europe. It moves from being the sublime port that all Europeans are desperate to trade with, because of course they have a monopoly on trade with Asia, to now Europeans have their own routes to Asia, which we'll talk about next unit. And so the Ottoman Empire starts to get cut out of the process. And the great powers of Europe start to look at this ancient empire and think, how can we use these forces of nationalism to sort of chip away at Ottoman territory for our own advantage? And so this is similar to some of the stuff we're going to talk about next unit with imperialism. So let's look at how these different pieces are chipped away. One of the biggest ways, or one of the most humiliating defeats for the Ottoman Empire, is losing Greece. Obviously, the Greeks are an ancient culture that have a very important role in world history, but they've never really been unified together into a Greece. Forces of nationalism spreading out of the French Revolution come to Greece, and there starts to be a movement, a desire for the Greeks to come together and form this thing called Greece. So the Greeks start this fight for independence and declare themselves a republic separate from the Ottoman Empire. But of course, Greece is an incredibly small, not that populous country, and the Ottoman Empire is still the Ottoman Empire. So there's really no way that they can break away from this large empire without help. So this brings us to the Battle of Navarino. The Greeks enlist the support of the French and the British, both of whom are looking to both help liberate Greece because they feel like Greece is an important part of the development of Western Europe, and Greek culture and society is an important factor here. But at the same time, they also want to weaken the Ottoman Empire. And so the Ottoman Empire sends a fleet to go try to crush Greece, and they meet a British and French fleet, which utterly eviscerates the Ottoman fleet, sinks them, and completely basically paves the way for Greek independence, because now the Ottoman Empire does not have an effective navy, and so they're not able to launch ships to go and recapture Greece. And so with the Battle of Navarino, it's obviously not quite as simple as that, but this is probably the biggest factor in Greece breaking away, and now Greece is its own independent thing. For the Ottoman Empire, of course, this is a massively eye-opening event, because it makes clear to basically everyone that unless they manage to modernize and change their society, they're going to fall apart very quickly. They've fallen significantly behind the European powers. Navarino clearly proved that. And so the reforming Sultan Mahmud II starts to push these reforms in a process called Tanzimat. It's a very slow process of reformation, but basically he's going to try to equalize, laws between Christian and Muslim subjects to cut down on issues of nationalism. He's going to try to open up the government to everybody based on merit, sort of similarly to what happened in France and sort of similar to your Mandarin system in China. We're going to start opening up new schools for everyone to educate them and hopefully help them embrace new sort of both industrial and agricultural techniques in order to improve the economy of the Ottoman Empire. And they're going to simplify the tax code by getting rid of their previous system of basically hiring random people to go around and collect taxes, which led to massive amounts of corruption. So all of these reforms are designed to sort of modernize and save the Ottoman Empire, but they're not universally popular. The biggest pushback against these reforms are the Janissaries. The Janissary Corps, as you hopefully remember, started out as a group of slave soldiers loyal to the Sultan that made up this elite fighting force within the Ottoman Empire. But over time, they became a hereditary bureaucracy, with fathers passing down posts to sons. And the problem with any hereditary bureaucracy is they're not being chosen based on their merit. They're not being chosen based on their skills. And so they end up being pretty ineffective and corrupt. And they start exerting significant pressure on sultans, occasionally deposing sultans who oppose them. So Mahmud II rises up against them here, or passes these reforms, basically getting the Janissaries out of power. The Janissaries then assault the Topkapi Palace, where they meet this new army that's been organized, and they get mowed down. Artillery is set up, and as the Janissaries try to charge, they get blown to pieces. Mahmud then basically starts this purge of the Janissaries and ends up eliminating them as a force within Ottoman society. Here we see accounts of the slaughter of Janissaries and then the complete abolition of the Janissary order. With the Janissaries gone, the Ottomans can now put together a modern military in the style of France or Germany, and they can now try to build a modern navy, starting to use new shipbuilding techniques. And so over the course of the next 20 years, they start building this modern navy, they start building this modern army, and now the Ottoman Empire feels like they're ready to try to go toe-to-toe with a European power again. They feel like they've gotten their they've rebuilt themselves, and they're ready to sort of take a seat at the great power table again. So that brings us to the Crimean War. The traditional enemy of the Ottoman Empire in Europe has been the Russians, because Russia, in order to try to get warm water ports, as we remember is very important to Russia because a significant portion of their coastline is on the Arctic Ocean, they have been encroaching on Ottoman territory for years, going all the way back to Catherine the Great and your sort of first Russo-Turkish War. And so this happens again in 1854. Russia tries to move in to, or is taking increasing control of the Crimean region, and the Ottoman Empire is trying to push them out, trying to get control of the Black Sea. And then there's this fight over some of these sort of Balkan territories, which are going to become hotbeds of problems in the future, of issues in the future. So, Crimean War, Ottoman Empire launches their massive new navy to go try to challenge the Russians, and they get utterly crushed. The new Ottoman navy turns out to be not as effective as they thought they would be, because although they used modern shipbuilding techniques, had armored hulls, things like that, they had not yet embraced the newest sort of naval invention, which was explosive shells. The Russian fleet fired these explosive shells, which instead of just trying to pierce through a ship's hull, would explode, causing massive amounts of damage. And so the beginning of the Crimean War basically illustrated that if you don't keep up with the latest sort of developments in naval warfare, your incredibly expensive fleet can be utterly destroyed by an enemy that's just a few years ahead of you. And so what everyone takes away from this is your naval budget needs to be huge if you're going to be a great power, because otherwise all that money is wasted if you don't have the latest naval inventions, which is going to be really important for us going forward as well. The ground portion of the war goes much better for the Ottoman Empire. They are able to land troops with the help of the British and the French. The British and the French, after seeing the Ottomans defeat the defeat of the Ottoman Navy, start to worry that Russia is getting too powerful. And so they jump in on the side of the Ottoman Empire to help them fight the Russians. And so the Crimean War turns into a massive slog. Both sides have extensive artillery and defensive fortifications. And so the traditional style of warfare in which one army charges the other army starts to become increasingly costly as both more accurate guns and larger artillery start to make those charges incredibly, incredibly deadly. So in the end, the Crimean War, at least the ground part of the Crimean War, ends up being a stalemate with massive amounts of people dying, both of disease and of being blown apart. And no one really wins or gets any new territory. But for the Ottoman Empire, it's sort of an affirmation on one hand that their modern army is now up to snuff, but it's also a repudiation of their navy. And the Ottoman Empire realizes they're going to have to spend a bunch more money if their navy is going to be in any way effective. So hopefully you can answer these questions. And when we come back tomorrow, we're going to move up and tell this story from the Russian perspective, as they are trying to deal with most of these problems, but with somewhat different solutions.